The morning sun hung low over the city, casting a golden hue across the pavement outside Jefferson Auto Repair. The soft hum of power tools mixed with the rhythmic clanking of wrenches inside the garage, the scent of oil and fresh rubber filling the air, like a signature. Marlon Brooks was already at work when the shop officially opened. Dressed in a dark blue coverall stained with grease and time, his movements were fluid, precise, and unhurried. His hands moved over the engine of a late-model sedan like a surgeon. His eyes narrowed with quiet focus. He had worked at Jefferson Auto for nearly 15 years, and there was a calm rhythm to everything he did, a quiet authority built not on ego but mastery. He didn't need to speak much. Everyone who worked with him knew the kind of mechanic he was: thorough, honest, respectful. His name was never shouted across the garage in frustration, only mentioned in appreciation. His presence carried weight, even in silence. It was just after 8:30 a.m. when the sharp whine of tires rolling over gravel signaled the arrival of a customer in something expensive. A sleek metallic silver European sedan pulled into the Bay Area, shining like it had been hand-buffed moments before. Out stepped a man in his late 40s, tall, lean, wearing a fitted golf shirt, sunglasses, and the unmistakable confidence of someone used to being served first and questioned later. The man, whose name no one yet knew, walked into the front office with a purposeful stride. Behind the desk was Caitlin, the receptionist and service coordinator. She smiled professionally, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" The man took off his sunglasses slowly, eyes scanning the space, before landing on the interior of the garage, where Marlon was wiping his hands near a tool bench. "I need a full service and brake inspection," he said. "Highway rattle I want diagnosed." Caitlin nodded and jotted it down. "Absolutely. Looks like Bay 2 is open. Marlon's available now, and he can take a look right away." The man's eyes sharpened. "Who?" "Marlon," Caitlin repeated, motioning through the window toward the garage. "Our lead technician." The man's gaze followed her gesture. He stared at Marlon for a moment longer than necessary, his face unreadable. Then, with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said, "Actually, I'd prefer someone else." Caitlin blinked. "I'm sorry? I'd prefer another mechanic." "No offense," he said, as if those two words could erase what was clearly already said. Caitlin hesitated. "Marlon's one of our most experienced techs. He's the one I trust with any high-end diagnostics." The man's voice dropped, slow and deliberate. "I said I'd prefer someone else. Maybe one of the younger guys. Just someone I can feel more confident about." He didn't say it. He didn't have to. Marlon, still within earshot, had paused his movement but didn't turn around. He'd heard that tone before, the carefully masked disdain behind polite words, the subtle redirection that always came dressed in justification. Caitlin stiffened but kept her voice composed. "We can assign another technician, of course, but I just want to be clear, it has nothing to do with Marlon's ability. He's more than qualified." The customer, whose name was now known to be Todd Henley, smiled. "I'm sure he's fine. I just have high standards for my car. You understand?" Marlon finally turned then, walking over with the kind of calm that didn't ask for anyone's comfort. He stood tall, his face neutral but unreadable, his gaze landing evenly on the customer. You don't want me working on it," he said, his voice low, steady. "That's your right." Todd gave a faint nod, satisfied, and turned back toward the seating area. Marlon glanced at Caitlin, who looked somewhere between furious and apologetic. He gave her a slight nod, just enough to say it's okay, even though they both knew it wasn't. Then he removed his gloves and walked back toward the side of the garage, picking up a clipboard for the next vehicle. He didn't slam it. He didn't sigh. He didn't raise his voice. He just went back to work. But the air in the shop had shifted. The other techs had heard. One looked up from under a lifted SUV. Another quietly turned down the radio. No one said anything, but the silence around them wasn't empty. It was full of recognition. They all knew what had just happened. What had really happened? And Marlon? He'd known it would, because in certain neighborhoods, at certain shops, under certain kinds of customers' gazes, being good wasn't always enough. But he wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to do the job right, whether anyone liked it or not. The tension lingered in the air long after Todd Henley settled into the waiting room chair, with his phone in one hand and a smug sense of victory in the other. He sat with his legs crossed and one arm draped over the back of the chair, scrolling casually through emails while pretending not to notice the glances being exchanged behind the service counter. Marlon had returned to his corner of the garage, cleaning tools with slow, methodical care, his face unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't look up, didn't react. But everyone could feel the shift in him. Not anger, not defeat, just that quiet retreat into practiced professionalism that black men like him learned to carry like armor. Caitlin stood behind the desk, her jaw clenched just slightly as she typed Todd's information into the system. She hated this part, the part where politeness became complicity. She had seen it before, the subtle ways some customers coded their prejudice into terms like preference or comfort. She'd once watched Marlon rebuild a transmission by feel alone when their diagnostic tool failed. He didn't need praise. He just needed fairness. And today, he didn't get it. Another technician, Jordan, was assigned to Todd's car. He was young, eager, and newly certified. A good kid still finding his rhythm with engines. He glanced nervously at the assignment sheet when Caitlin handed it to him. "You sure?" he asked under his breath. Caitlin didn't answer directly. "Just do your best. Let me know if you need anything." Jordan nodded, but he hesitated before walking out to the car. He knew Marlon had already looked the vehicle over briefly when it first pulled in. Marlon had a habit of giving each car a quick preliminary glance, even before the formal inspection. It was part of what made him great. He saw problems others didn't. Out in the garage, Jordan approached Marlon quietly. "Hey, you got a chance to look at that silver Vantage?" Marlon didn't look up. "Yeah, briefly. Brake line's iffy. Front left. Could be pressure loss. Didn't touch it. Was told not to." Jordan frowned. "Should I tell him?" "Already did," Marlon said, wiping off a wrench. He didn't care. Let him ride it out. Jordan stood there for a second longer, unsure of what to say. Then he nodded and walked toward the car, clipboard in hand, heart beating a little harder than it had earlier. Back in the waiting area, Todd was sipping complimentary coffee and watching a news segment on the mounted television. He didn't look up when Jordan approached to ask about any prior issues with the brakes. "Just do the inspection," he said, not unkindly but dismissively, like someone brushing away a waiter offering a refill. "I've got a warranty. Just mark what's needed and move on." Jordan went back to the garage. He performed the inspection carefully, checking fluids, scanning the onboard diagnostics, inspecting the suspension. But when he got to the brakes, he hesitated. He remembered what Marlon had said. Pressure loss, front left. It wasn't immediately obvious. The system read clean, no glaring issues, but something about the feel of it, the softness in the pedal response, the faint residue on the valve, gave him pause. He walked back to Caitlin. "He's good to go for now, but I'd recommend a deeper look at the brakes soon." "Did you tell him that?" "I tried." Caitlin exhaled. "Let it go. He's already convinced he knows better. Just print the receipt." Jordan went back to his work. Marlon remained silent. He didn't make a scene. He didn't complain. He just moved on to the next vehicle, a red minivan with a cracked taillight and a check engine light that had been blinking for weeks. Inside the lobby, Todd was wrapping up his call. "Yeah, I'm heading out now," he said. "Had to deal with some incompetence first thing this morning, but I got it handled. You know how it is." He stood, straightened his collar, and walked to the front desk. Caitlin handed him the keys, her smile mechanical. "Everything's documented." Jordan completed the service. Oil change, tire rotation, basic inspection. "We recommend a follow-up on the brake system, but nothing urgent flagged today." Todd took the keys with a dismissive nod. "Of course, I'll have my guy look it over later." "Safe driving," Caitlin said, and meant it. Todd didn't say goodbye. He walked confidently through the front door and out into the sunlight, the keys to his perfectly waxed car swinging on his finger like a prize. Back in the garage, Marlon didn't watch him leave. He just kept working. But in his silence, something was building. Not bitterness, not revenge, but a patient certainty. A truth that didn't need to be spoken to be real. And within minutes, that truth would show itself to everyone. The midday sun was at its peak, casting sharp reflections off windshields and baking the pavement outside Jefferson Auto Repair until it shimmered like glass. Inside, the fans hummed overhead and the low drone of conversation and clanging tools continued as usual. But Marlon hadn't stopped thinking about the car. He didn't believe in rushing work, and he certainly didn't believe in letting ego get in the way of safety, his or anyone else's. Despite being ordered off the job, despite the blatant disrespect from the customer, he still couldn't shake the memory of what he'd seen beneath that polished silver exterior. It had only been a quick glance, less than 5 minutes. But for someone like Marlon, that was enough. He'd spotted it while the vehicle was still coasting into the service bay. A subtle drag in the front wheel, the kind that could mean brake pressure loss. Once parked, he had stooped down instinctively to scan the lines. It was faint, barely a whisper of seepage, but it was there. A pinhole leak, likely hidden in a joint. the kind that wouldn't trigger the sensor until it was too late. Now, the customer was long gone, and the memory of that brief inspection gnawed at him. He'd already told Jordan what he saw. He had told Caitlin, too, and the customer had dismissed them both. But something in Marlon refused to let it go completely. He pulled off his gloves and walked up to the front office, wiping his hands on a rag. Caitlin was typing up an invoice, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Did the Vantage leave?" he asked. She looked up. "Yeah, 15 minutes ago. Peeled out of here like it was a racetrack." Marlon gave a small nod, not surprised. "I'm not trying to start anything, but I just want it noted officially." The left front brake line had signs of a slow leak. Tiny, almost invisible. But it's there. If something happens down the road, I want to be able to say we flagged it. Caitlin paused, understanding the seriousness in his voice. She clicked through the system and added the note manually. "You want me to attach it to the customer's file?" "Yeah, put it on record. If he comes back, or if someone else does, I want it written down that we didn't miss it. He refused the advice, but we gave it." She finished typing and looked up. "Now you think it's that bad?" "I think he's headed into weekend traffic with brakes that might hold today but fail tomorrow. Or fail at the wrong second." Caitlin leaned back in her chair, letting out a quiet breath. "Got it. It's in the file now." "Thanks," Marlon said, and turned to head back to the garage. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. But he was certain. This wasn't about pride. It was about responsibility. It was about the line between doing your job and doing what's right, even when your job gets taken from you in the moment. Marlon moved back to his lift station, refocusing his mind on the next vehicle. But he couldn't fully shake the weight that clung to his shoulders. Something about this one didn't feel finished. Out on the road, Todd was weaving through afternoon traffic on the expressway, sunglasses perched on his nose, music pulsing through his car's high-end speakers. He was still feeling smug, replaying the morning's events in his head with self-satisfaction. He had made his point, had taken control of the situation. No one told him who touched his car. He paid for quality and he made sure he got it, on his terms. He didn't notice the faint sponginess in the brake pedal at first. Not on the wide, flat roads of the business district. It was only when he approached the downhill slope leading toward the riverfront that he felt it, the pedal giving a little too much, requiring just a bit more pressure than usual. He furrowed his brow, pumped it once, twice. The car slowed, but not with the firm response he expected. He chalked it up to the heat. Maybe the pads were warm, maybe it was just his imagination. But he gripped the wheel a little tighter. A few more blocks passed and he reached a traffic light. As he braked again, the resistance was softer. Still functional, but off. His instincts began to hum. Something wasn't right. Still, pride overrode caution. He turned the corner toward downtown, where shops and pedestrians clustered together and Saturday traffic picked up. The hum of tires on asphalt, the crosswalks blinking with motion. It was there, on a narrow one-lane street just outside a bustling cafe, that the car gave its first real warning. Todd pressed the brake at the stop sign, and this time, it sank further than expected. The car slowed, but not completely. He had to yank the emergency brake halfway to avoid rolling into the intersection. He froze. The car was still running. The dashboard was clean. No warning lights, no alarms. But his body told him what the display refused to. He had a problem. Behind him, a car honked. Another pulled around. A cyclist tapped his window lightly and shouted, "You okay, man?" Todd waved him off, jaw tight. He tried to pull forward again, gently this time, easing the car down the block and into a parking space. He parked crookedly, half on the line, and turned the engine off. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing, processing. Then he reached for his phone. Back at Jefferson Auto, Caitlin's phone rang. She answered in her usual tone. "Jefferson Auto, Caitlin speaking." The voice on the other end was tight, clipped. "Hi, this is Todd Henley. I was there earlier today. My car's having brake issues. The pedal's soft. Almost failed at an intersection." Caitlin kept her tone measured. "I see. Mr. Henley, I do have a note on your file from our lead technician. He flagged a potential leak in the front brake line before you left." There was a pause. "He what?" "He wasn't assigned to your car, per your request, but he inspected it briefly and documented a concern. We advised follow-up. It's in our system." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "Can I bring it back in?" "Yes, sir, we recommend that you do, right away." Caitlin hung up and turned toward the garage. Marlon was already walking in from the back, wiping his hands, the quiet weight in his eyes, giving her the answer before she could even speak. "He's on his way back," she said. Marlon nodded once. "I'll be ready." The roar of the engine was strained, hesitant. Todd steered the silver Vantage back toward Jefferson Auto, with a stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there that morning. The ride back was tense, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he gently worked the brake pedal, testing it at every stoplight, trying to calculate the risk of each block he passed. The pedal no longer offered consistent resistance. It was soft, occasionally sinking further than it should, and he could feel the delay between pressure and response. His confidence in the machine, once absolute, was now slipping away as fast as his earlier arrogance. The dashboard continued to give no warning, as if mocking him with its silence. But the problem was there, growing, unpredictable, coiled under the surface like a frayed wire waiting to snap. He turned into the service lot carefully, rolling to a stop in a spot near the garage door. The car shuddered slightly as it halted, like even it was relieved to be still. For a moment, he didn't move. He sat behind the wheel, watching the motion through the shop window. Mechanics going about their work, tools clinking, hydraulic lifts rising and falling. Then, with a heavy exhale, he stepped out. The moment he opened the door, the eyes of several employees flicked toward him. Not hostile, not warm, just watchful. They knew. Word had spread fast after the phone call. And though no one said anything, the silence around him felt amplified, weighted with a quiet accountability. Todd walked toward the front office. Caitlin saw him coming and met him halfway, clipboard in hand, professional as ever. He noticed now that her tone was firm but not unfriendly, a kind of practiced grace that carried with it the memory of everything she had witnessed that morning. "Mr. Henley," she said, "well, you mentioned an issue with the brakes?" "Yes," he said, voice lower than before. "It started right after I left. It's not stopping like it should. No warning lights, but the pedal's spongy. Nearly rolled through a sign." Caitlin nodded. "We have a note from earlier. As I mentioned on the phone, our lead technician observed a potential issue with your front brake line. It was documented." Todd adjusted the collar of his shirt, suddenly uncomfortable under the fluorescent lights and the weight of his own choices. "I'd like someone to look at it now, please." Caitlin didn't flinch. "Absolutely. One moment." She turned and signaled toward the garage. Marlon was already walking toward them, wiping his hands on a fresh towel. His gait was calm, deliberate, and when his eyes met Todd's, there was no visible anger, no gloating, no sarcasm, just the steady gaze of someone who had seen this play out before in a dozen quiet ways. Todd straightened a little as Marlon approached. "I understand you're having an issue with the brake response?" Marlon asked evenly. "Yes," Todd said, swallowing his pride. I think you were right." Marlon gave a single nod. "Let's take a look." They walked in silence to the car. Marlon slid into the driver's seat and pumped the brake pedal a few times. His face remained neutral, but his brow furrowed slightly. Then he stepped out, popped the hood, and knelt beside the front wheel. Within minutes, he found the leak, just as he'd suspected. A fine bead of brake fluid marked the connection point at the front left caliper, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. He stood and walked back over to Caitlin. Confirmed, he's losing pressure on the front left. Hairline crack in the connector fitting. Could have gone unnoticed for another day, or it could have failed completely in traffic. Caitlin wrote the note down immediately. Todd hovered nearby, listening. His mouth was slightly open, his pride deflating more with each word. "We'll need to replace the line and bleed the system," Marlon continued. "Safe to drive afterward." Todd looked at him directly now, and for the first time that day, the arrogance was gone. "You tried to tell me earlier, didn't you?" "I did," Marlon said. No heat in his voice, no judgment, just truth. Todd looked down at the pavement. His hands fidgeted with the car keys in his pocket. "I didn't listen. That's on me." Marlon didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward the lift bay to begin the repair. As the car was raised into the air, more employees glanced in Todd's direction. Some with quiet disapproval, some with understanding. But none of them approached him. There was no need. The scene had already spoken volumes. Inside the office, Caitlin processed the updated invoice. She kept her tone professional when Todd came in to approve the repairs. But the air between them had changed. She wasn't trying to make him feel comfortable anymore. She was simply doing her job, the same way Marlon had tried to do his before being dismissed. Todd watched from the waiting room as Marlon worked, His movements were fluid, confident. The car was lifted, the part replaced, the fluid refilled and bled from the system, each step performed with precision. In under 40 minutes, the issue was resolved. When Marlon returned with the keys, Todd stood slowly. He took them with both hands, like someone accepting more than just metal and plastic, like someone taking back the responsibility they had tried to avoid. "Thank you," he said, voice quieter than it had been all day. Marlon nodded. "Drive safe." And with that, he turned and walked away, not triumphant, not angry, just complete. He had done what he always did, the work, and whether anyone acknowledged it or not, that work had just saved someone's life. Maybe even the life of the man who hadn't thought he was good enough to hold a wrench. The quiet inside the waiting room felt heavier than it had earlier in the day, as if the air itself had been thickened by the gravity of what had just occurred. Todd remained seated after receiving his keys, staring at them in his hands, turning them slowly between his fingers. They felt colder than they should have, and heavier too, like they carried more than just the ability to start an engine. For the first time since he entered Jefferson Auto that morning, he wasn't thinking about his car's paint job or performance specs or luxury features. He was thinking about how close he'd come to learning a lesson the hard way, and how the man he'd insulted with his silence and his ego had been the one who'd ultimately protected him. He could see Marlon through the glass divider, now already working on the next car. There was no sign that anything had happened, no fanfare, no gestures of superiority. Marlon was in the same coveralls, standing in the same position he always had, moving with that same focused steadiness that said he didn't need anyone's applause. Todd watched him check a dipstick, wipe it with a cloth, and lower the hood of a different car, the routine of it all making the moment feel even more stark. Here was a man who had every reason to be resentful, and yet he had chosen to stay professional, to do the job, and to do it right. Todd stood slowly and approached the service counter. Caitlin looked up, unsurprised but unreadable. She didn't soften or harden her expression. She simply waited, pen poised in hand, the invoice on the screen before her. "I'd like to pay for everything in full," Todd said quietly. Caitlin gave a small nod. "We had a promotion running today, discounted rate on diagnostics, but I can remove that if you'd prefer." "No," Todd said quickly. "Leave it full, please." She tapped a few keys. The printer hummed. She handed him the receipt and card reader, and he completed the transaction in silence. After signing, he looked around the room, as though hoping someone else would tell him what to do next, how to proceed, how to make right what had gone so clearly wrong. But there was no instruction manual for dignity, and no shortcut to redemption. Only effort, only sincerity. "Would it be okay if I—" Todd asked, gesturing vaguely toward the garage. Caitlin glanced over her shoulder. "He's working, but if you want to speak to him, do it respectfully." "I will," Todd replied. "I owe him that much." He stepped into the garage, the change in temperature immediate, the air warmer, more alive, full of the scent of grease, steel, and determination. The sound of impact wrenches and compressors filled the space, but Marlon somehow still moved through it all with an uncanny sense of calm. He didn't hear Todd approach at first, so Todd stood just outside the lift station, waiting until Marlon placed a wrench down and straightened his back. Marlon turned, wiping his hands. He raised an eyebrow slightly at the sight of the customer standing before him again. Todd began, the words halting on his tongue like they didn't quite know how to form. "I came to say thank you, and I'm sorry." Marlon didn't say anything immediately. He simply tilted his head slightly, watching the man, reading his face, searching for the truth behind the words. "I misjudged you," Todd continued, "and I didn't even give you a chance to prove yourself. And if I'm honest, I know exactly why. It wasn't about the car. It was about me, about what I assumed. And I was wrong. Completely." Marlon stood still for a long beat. Then he nodded once, slowly. "I appreciate you saying that," he said, voice even, not cold, but guarded. Todd took a small step forward. "You didn't have to help me. You could have said nothing. Let me drive off. And maybe something would have happened, maybe not. But the fact that you still cared enough to speak up, that means something. It means a lot." Marlon looked him in the eye. "I didn't do it for you," he said plainly. "I did it because that's the job. Doesn't matter who's behind the wheel. My name's on the work, whether people know it or not. And I take that seriously." Todd nodded, chastened. "Well, I respect that. More than you know." Marlon gave him a long look and then, with a slight movement, extended a hand. Todd took it. The handshake was firm, brief, but powerful. A moment of understanding passed between them. Not absolution, not friendship, but a kind of mutual recognition. Acknowledgement. Then, with no more to say, Marlon turned back to his workstation and resumed his task. Todd left the garage more slowly than he had arrived. He opened the door to his luxury car, sat down, and took a moment before starting the engine. When it purred to life, it sounded different. Not because of the repair, but because of what had changed in him. Back inside the garage, the rhythm continued. Another car, another engine, another person who wouldn't know the name of the man who kept them safe, who fixed the thing they didn't understand, who made no speeches, gave no lectures, just showed up every day and did the work better than anyone else. And though the world outside might never give Marlon the respect he deserved freely, he had earned something far more enduring. The respect of those who knew what integrity really looked like. And in that moment, no one could deny it, especially not the man who had once tried to. It was just past closing time at Jefferson Auto, and the usual noise of the garage had faded into a calm, steady quiet. The last car had rolled off the lot. The shutters were half drawn, and the faint sound of an old radio playing blues echoed from the back workbench where Marlon sat alone. The day had been long, eventful, draining, but he moved through the motions of closing down with the same patience and diligence he brought to everything he touched. He tightened the last cap on a container of coolant, wiped down the worn metal surface in front of him, and glanced out toward the parking lot bathed in amber light from the setting sun. Caitlin poked her head in from the front. "You good?" she asked, already locking up the office. Marlon nodded. "Yeah, just wrapping up." She hesitated, then said, "That guy, Todd, left a message on the shop line after he drove off. Said he wanted to leave a positive review online. Said he was going to tell his company about the service, too." Marlon didn't look up. "That's so." Caitlin crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "He sounded changed. I don't know. Humbled, maybe. Still a little awkward, but sincere." Marlon gave a faint grunt of acknowledgement. Not dismissive, but grounded. Sometimes the lesson doesn't land until the wheels start shaking. She smiled at that, a little rueful. He's lucky it wasn't worse. Marlon stood up and reached for his jacket. Luck didn't fix his brakes, work did. Caitlin looked at him then, more directly. "You know, not many people would have handled it like you did. The way you stayed calm still gave him the warning, still took care of him." He shrugged gently. "It's not about him, it's about who I am. If I start letting other people define my worth, I'm just handing over something I've built for years." She nodded slowly. "Well, for what it's worth, a lot of people here noticed. Jordan? He said he learned more from watching how you carried yourself today than from any repair diagram." That made Marlon pause. He looked toward the bay where Jordan usually worked. His eyes softened slightly. "That's the real work, isn't it? Fixing more than engines." Outside, the sky had begun to shift from gold to indigo, streaks of soft purple lining the horizon. The neighborhood surrounding the shop began to quiet, the last commuters fading into the distance. Marlon stepped outside and stood by his truck, hands in his pockets, breathing in the night air. There was peace in this moment, but it was hard-earned peace. Not the kind handed out easily, but the kind forged in the fire of being doubted, dismissed, and still choosing to show up better than expected. He thought about Todd, not with anger, but with reflection. Men like him had passed through Marlon's life many times, some who never learned, and some who did but too late. Today had been different. Not perfect, not clean, but honest. Something had broken loose in that man's pride, and maybe, just maybe, it would grow into something better. It wasn't Marlon's job to finish that process. He had only lit the fuse. As he turned the key in his truck and pulled onto the road, Marlon didn't think of himself as a hero. He didn't even think of himself as vindicated. He thought of the next day's work, the next machine, the next customer walking in with assumptions he might have to gently disassemble one bolt at a time. Because this wasn't about revenge or recognition, it was about legacy. He drove past the row of streetlights, their glow bouncing off his windshield, and reflected on how often quiet dignity had carried him through spaces that weren't made for him. How many times he had to be twice as good just to be seen as enough. But he had never let that break him. He never lowered his standard to meet someone else's prejudice. And today, in the smallest but clearest way, that standard had spoken louder than words ever could. Back at the garage, Caitlin finished locking up and turned off the lights. Inside, the shop was dark now, but not empty. It held something more than tools and parts. It held the kind of story that didn't need to go viral to matter. a story about how, in a world full of noise, real strength is often quiet, real respect is earned, and real change, no matter how small, starts the moment one man decides to be better, even when the world gives him every excuse not to be. And so, as the city settled into night, the lesson of the day remained, tucked quietly in the back corner of a garage, where one mechanic with steady hands and an unshakable core reminded everyone watching that dignity doesn't shout. It simply does the job, does it right, and lets the truth speak for itself.